The Battle of Yarmouk, how 25,000 Arab Muslims annihilated 150,000 Byzantine soldiers in 6 days. Before we dive into the battle that erased Christian dominance in the Middle East forever, let me ask you something. What happens when the oldest, most sophisticated empire in the world, fresh from victory over Persia, sends its largest army in a century against a force of desert warriors who have been unified under a new religion for barely a decade? What happens when numerical superiority, better equipment, and 1,000 years of military tradition meet mobility, fanaticism, and a commander so brilliant that his tactics are still studied in military academies today? You're about to find out. And if you think you know this story because you've heard about early Islamic conquests, I promise you don't know it like this. No religious propaganda, no civilizational narratives. Just the tactics, the terrain, the command decisions, and the brutal reality of what happened when 25,000 Arab Muslims destroyed the largest Byzantine army ever fielded and changed the course of world history in 6 days. If this is the kind of history you're here for, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what battle I should cover next. That's all I'm asking. Now let's go back to August 636 AD, to the plains near the Yarmouk River in southern Syria, where the Byzantine Empire would lose everything it had held for 6 centuries in the most catastrophic defeat in its history. The Byzantine Empire in 636 was exhausted but triumphant. Emperor Heraclius, one of the greatest military minds Byzantium ever produced, had just concluded a 26-year war with the Sassanid Persian Empire, Rome's ancient rival. It had been a desperate, existential conflict. The Persians had conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, had besieged Constantinople itself, had nearly destroyed the empire. Heraclius, in a series of brilliant campaigns from 622 to 628, had invaded Persia, defeated their armies, forced a peace treaty that returned all conquered territories, and restored Byzantine prestige. He had returned the true cross to Jerusalem in triumph in 630, walking barefoot into the holy city as a conquering hero and defender of Christendom. The empire was saved, or so it seemed, but the victory over Persia had cost everything. The Byzantine treasury was bankrupt. The army was depleted, veterans exhausted from decades of war. The provinces of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, reconquered from Persia, were devastated, populations reduced, cities damaged, agriculture disrupted. The religious unity of the empire was fracturing, with Monophysite Christians in Egypt and Syria increasingly alienated from the Orthodox establishment in Constantinople. The empire was a hollow shell, magnificent on the surface, fragile underneath. And while Byzantium and Persia had been destroying each other, something new had emerged in the Arabian Peninsula. In 632, the Prophet Muhammad died in Medina, having unified the fractious Arab tribes under Islam. Within a decade, his successors, the Rashidun caliphs, had directed Arab armies north into Byzantine and Persian territory. The initial raids were opportunistic, testing the borders, seizing plunder, but the Arabs found that the great empires were weaker than anyone expected. Persian armies were defeated at the Battle of Qadisiyah in 636, and within a decade, the entire Sassanid Empire would collapse. Byzantine Syria fell quickly. Damascus surrendered in 634. Jerusalem fell in 637. By 636, nearly the entire Levant was under Arab control, and Heraclius, watching from Antioch, realized that this was not a raid or a passing threat. This was a conquest. He assembled the largest army Byzantium could muster and sent it to Syria to crush the Arabs and reclaim the lost provinces. The Byzantine army that marched south in the summer of 636 numbered somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 men. The exact number is disputed because medieval sources exaggerate, but even conservative estimates put it well over 100,000. It was a massive, polyglot force. The core was Armenian cavalry, heavy cataphracts in armor with lances and swords, some of the finest cavalry in the world. There were Thracian and Anatolian infantry, professional soldiers from the themes, the military districts of the empire, Slavic and Lombard mercenaries, Ghassanid Arab auxiliaries, Christian Arabs who had long served as Byzantine clients and were now facing their Muslim cousins. The command structure was fractured, multiple generals with overlapping authority, political appointees competing with field commanders. The supreme commander was Vahan, an Armenian general, competent but not brilliant, constrained by having to coordinate with other generals who resented his authority. The Arab army facing this Byzantine colossus numbered approximately 25,000 men, possibly slightly more. They were organized into mobile cavalry units, light and medium horsemen armed with lances, swords, and bows, and infantry equipped with spears, swords, and shields. Most were tribesmen from the Arabian Peninsula, Bedouins who had spent their lives riding and fighting in the desert, now united under Islam and the leadership of the caliphs. They were motivated by religion, by the promise of paradise for those who died in jihad, by the prospect of plunder, and by the camaraderie of tribal identity now subsumed into a larger Islamic identity. But their greatest asset was their commander, Khalid ibn al-Walid. Khalid was in his mid-50s in 636, a veteran of the early Islamic conquests, a man who had fought against Muhammad at the Battle of Uhud, and then, after converting to Islam, became one of its greatest military commanders. He had conquered Central Arabia, led armies into Iraq, defeated the Persians, and then marched across the Syrian desert to reinforce the Muslim armies fighting in the Levant. Khalid was a tactical genius, understanding mobility, deception, and the importance of terrain in ways that anticipated later military theorists by centuries. He was also ruthless, willing to sacrifice his own men if it achieved victory, and charismatic, able to inspire fanatical loyalty. The Arab soldiers called him Saif Allah, the sword of God. His presence on the battlefield was worth thousands of men. The Byzantine army advanced into southern Syria, moving along the road network toward the Arab positions. Heraclius did not accompany the army, remaining in Antioch, but he sent detailed strategic instructions. The plan was to use overwhelming numbers to force a decisive battle, crush the Arab army, reclaim Damascus and the other lost cities, and restore imperial control. It was sound strategy if the Arabs fought a conventional battle. The problem was that Khalid had no intention of fighting conventionally. He chose the battlefield carefully, positioning his army near the Yarmouk River, a tributary of the Jordan, where the terrain favored mobility and created natural obstacles that could trap an enemy. The ground was broken, with ravines and wadis cutting through the landscape, making it difficult for large formations to maneuver, but perfect for cavalry raids and ambushes. The battle began on August 15, 636, and lasted 6 days. The Byzantines attacked first, attempting to use their numerical superiority to overwhelm the Arab lines. Byzantine infantry advanced in dense formations, supported by Armenian cavalry on the flanks. The Arabs held their positions, infantry absorbing the initial shock, cavalry harassing the Byzantine flanks. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand combat with swords, spears, and axes, both sides taking heavy casualties. By the end of the first day, the Byzantines had gained some ground, but had not broken the Arab lines. The Arabs pulled back in good order, reforming their positions overnight. The second and third days followed a similar pattern. Byzantine attacks, heavy fighting, incremental gains, but no decisive breakthrough. The Byzantines were fighting the kind of battle they were trained for: dense infantry pushing forward, cavalry protecting the flanks, artillery, catapults, and ballistae bombarding the enemy from range. But the Arabs were not standing still. Khalid used mobile cavalry to hit Byzantine supply lines, to raid the camps, to create chaos in the rear. Byzantine soldiers, exhausted from the fighting, returned to camp to find their supplies looted, their horses stolen, their wounded massacred. Morale began to crack. On the fourth day, a dust storm blew across the battlefield, one of the violent Khamsin winds that sweeps out of the desert, reducing visibility to yards. The storm hit the Byzantine lines from the front, blowing sand and grit into their faces, blinding them, disrupting formations. The Arabs, more accustomed to desert conditions, attacked through the storm, cavalry charges hitting disoriented Byzantine units, cutting them down before they could organize a defense. It was not divine intervention, it was environmental luck, but the effect was devastating. Byzantine casualties spiked, entire units were scattered, and the army's cohesion began to deteriorate. The fifth day is remembered in Arab chronicles as the Day of Lost Eyes. Byzantine attacks continued, but desperation was setting in. The Byzantines were running low on supplies, their casualties were mounting, and the realization was spreading that they were not winning. Khalid, sensing the shift in morale, launched counterattacks, sending his cavalry to probe for weak points in the Byzantine lines. At one critical moment, Arab women from the camp, who had been tending the wounded and providing support, saw Arab soldiers retreating and blocked their path, shaming them, some even taking up weapons and fighting to prevent a rout. The story, likely embellished in later retellings, became a symbol of Islamic determination. Whether it happened exactly as described or not, the Arab forces rallied, pushed back the Byzantine attacks, and held their ground. By the morning of the sixth day, August 20th, both armies were exhausted, but the Byzantines were in worse shape. Their supplies were nearly gone, their cavalry was depleted, their infantry units were at half strength. Khalid saw the opportunity. He organized a coordinated assault, hitting the Byzantine flanks simultaneously while pinning the center with infantry. The plan was to encircle the Byzantine army, cut off their retreat, and destroy them against the natural barriers of the Yarmouk River and the ravines behind them. The Arab cavalry charges on the sixth day were decisive. Khalid personally led a unit of elite cavalry against the Byzantine left flank, breaking through, wheeling around to attack the rear. On the right, other Arab commanders executed the same maneuver. The Byzantine army, already demoralized and exhausted, found itself attacked from three sides. Panic spread. Units began to break, soldiers attempting to flee, but there was nowhere to go. Behind them was the Yarmouk River and a series of steep ravines, impassable for formed units, deadly for fleeing men. The Byzantines were trapped. The slaughter was apocalyptic. Byzantine soldiers, trying to escape, were driven toward the ravines. Men fell over the edges, tumbling into the gorges, crushed by those falling on top of them, trampled by horses. Arab cavalry pursued, cutting down anyone they could reach. Some Byzantine units tried to surrender, but in the chaos, quarter was rarely given. The Arab cavalry, their blood up, saw this as the final blow against an enemy that had resisted for 6 days. By the end of the day, the Byzantine army had ceased to exist. Estimates of Byzantine casualties range from 70,000 to over 100,000 dead, with thousands more captured. It was one of the most complete annihilations of a field army in ancient or medieval history. The Arab casualties were significant, probably several thousand dead and many more wounded over the 6 days of fighting, but they had won. Decisively, completely, the Byzantine Empire's military presence in Syria was destroyed. The survivors fled north, pursued by Arab cavalry for miles. Vahan, the Byzantine commander, barely escaped with his life. Heraclius, receiving news of the disaster in Antioch, reportedly wept and withdrew into Anatolia, never to return to Syria. He died in 641, a broken man, watching the empire he had saved from Persia crumble before a new enemy he didn't understand. The immediate aftermath was the collapse of Byzantine Syria. Cities that had resisted Arab sieges, hoping for relief from Heraclius's army, now surrendered. Antioch fell. Aleppo fell. The entire Levant, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, was under Arab control by 638. Egypt would fall by 642. North Africa would follow. Within a century, the Arab Islamic Empire would stretch from Spain to India, the fastest expansion of any empire in history. and it all became inevitable at Yarmouk. The long-term consequences reshaped the world. The Byzantine Empire, once spanning the Mediterranean, was reduced to Anatolia, Greece, and isolated holdings in Italy. Constantinople would survive for another 8 centuries, but it would never reclaim Syria, Palestine, or Egypt. The religious geography of the Middle East changed permanently. Christianity, which had been the dominant religion from Jerusalem to Antioch to Alexandria for 6 centuries, retreated. Islam became the dominant faith of the Levant, Mesopotamia, North Africa, and eventually beyond. The Christian communities that remained, Copts in Egypt, Maronites in Lebanon, Syriac Christians in Syria and Iraq, became minorities in lands they had once dominated. Culturally, Yarmouk marked the beginning of the Islamic Golden Age. The Arab conquests brought Greek, Persian, Indian, and eventually Chinese knowledge into contact, creating centers of learning in Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo. Islamic civilization would preserve and expand upon classical knowledge, while Christian Europe descended into the fragmentation and intellectual contraction of the early Middle Ages. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy all flourished under Islamic patronage. The translation movement in Baghdad, where Greek texts were translated into Arabic, preserved works that would have been lost otherwise and reintroduced them to Europe centuries later during the Renaissance. Geopolitically, Yarmouk created a permanent division between the Christian and Islamic worlds. The Mediterranean, which had been a Roman lake for 1,000 years, became a contested frontier. The Crusades, 4 centuries later, were an attempt to reverse the consequences of battles like Yarmouk, to reclaim the Holy Land and restore Christian control. They failed. The division hardened, and the Middle East remained Islamic while Europe remained Christian, a division that persists today and still shapes global conflicts. How did 25,000 Arabs destroy a Byzantine army 6 times their size? Start with leadership. Khalid ibn al-Walid was one of history's great commanders, understanding mobility, terrain, and the psychology of warfare in ways his opponents did not. His decision to position the Arab army with the Yarmouk ravines behind them was risky. It meant there was no retreat if they lost, but it also created a killing ground for the enemy. His use of cavalry to disrupt Byzantine supply lines and morale before the decisive blow was textbook asymmetric warfare, and his ability to coordinate simultaneous attacks on both flanks on the 6th day showed a level of tactical control that the fractured Byzantine command could not match. Then tactics. The Arab army was built for mobility. They could engage, disengage, reposition, and strike again faster than the Byzantines could respond. Byzantine heavy cavalry and infantry were designed for set-piece battles, grinding attrition warfare. When the battle became fluid, chaotic, the Byzantine advantages in armor and numbers were negated. The Arabs fought the way steppe nomads had fought for centuries, harassing, retreating, hitting weak points, refusing to stand still long enough for the enemy to bring their full strength to bear. Morale and motivation. The Arab soldiers were fighting for a new religion that promised paradise for those who died in battle. They were recent converts, many of them, the fervor of new belief making them willing to take risks and endure hardships that more cynical veterans would not. The Byzantine soldiers were fighting for an empire that had just exhausted itself in a 26-year war, for provinces many of them had never seen, under commanders who were more concerned with politics than victory. When the battle turned against them, Byzantine units broke and fled. When Arab units were pressed, they rallied and fought harder. Environmental factors. The dust storm on the 4th day was luck, but it was luck that favored the side more adapted to desert conditions. The Arabs, many of them Bedouins, knew how to fight in sandstorms, how to navigate by instinct, how to use the environment. The Byzantines from Anatolia, the Balkans, Armenia, had no such experience. The storm broke their formations and allowed the Arabs to inflict disproportionate casualties. Geography. The Yarmouk River and the ravines were natural barriers that Khalid used brilliantly. He forced the Byzantines to attack across ground where their numerical superiority was difficult to utilize, and when they broke, the same terrain that limited their offense became a death trap for their retreat. Thousands of Byzantine soldiers died not from Arab swords, but from falling into ravines, from being crushed by their own comrades, from drowning in the river. Geography was as much Khalid's weapon as his cavalry. Finally, the broader strategic exhaustion of the Byzantine Empire. Heraclius had defeated Persia, but the victory had cost the empire its military reserves, its economic strength, and the loyalty of its eastern provinces. The people of Syria and Egypt, many of them Monophysite Christians who had been persecuted by the Orthodox establishment in Constantinople, did not rally to defend the empire. Some welcomed the Arabs as liberators from Byzantine taxation and religious oppression. The empire was hollow, and Yarmouk exposed that hollowness. The Battle of Yarmouk is less famous in the West than battles like Tours or Vienna, but it was far more consequential. Tours stopped one Arab raid into France. Yarmouk destroyed Byzantine control of the Levant forever. If the Byzantines had won at Yarmouk, if they had crushed Khalid's army and reclaimed Syria, the Islamic expansion might have stalled. The caliphate, facing defeat, might have fragmented back into tribal conflicts. The history of Christianity and Islam, the religious geography of the Middle East, the cultural development of Europe and the Islamic world all might have been different, but the Byzantines did not win. They were destroyed, and the world changed. And here's the final irony. Heraclius, the man who saved the Byzantine Empire from Persia, who returned the true cross to Jerusalem, who was hailed as the greatest emperor since Justinian, died watching everything he had fought for collapse. He had spent his life defeating the wrong enemy. While Byzantium and Persia exhausted themselves in mutual destruction, the Arabs, unified under Islam, had been watching and waiting. They struck when both empires were weakest, and they won. Heraclius's greatest victory, the defeat of Persia, made possible his greatest defeat, the loss of the eastern provinces. History has few ironies sharper than that. But on August 20th, 636, on the plains near the Yarmouk River, as 70,000 Byzantine soldiers fell into ravines or were cut down by Arab cavalry, as the largest army the empire had fielded in a century disintegrated into a panicked mob. As Khalid ibn al-Walid watched his outnumbered force destroy an empire's hope of survival, none of the long-term consequences mattered. What mattered was that the Arabs had won. What mattered was that the Byzantine Empire had lost Syria forever. What mattered was that 1,000 years of Roman and Byzantine dominance in the Levant ended in 6 days. One battle, one brilliant commander, one catastrophic Byzantine collapse, and the Middle East became Islamic. That's the story of Yarmouk. No religious triumphalism, no civilizational narratives, just tactics, terrain, and the brutal arithmetic of warfare, where mobility and leadership defeat numbers and tradition. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a video. Share this with anyone who thinks the outcome of battles is determined by numbers alone. Drop a comment telling me what you thought, what I missed, what battle you want me to cover next. This is history without the filter, and we're just getting started.